So, welcome. This breakout session is titled From Catching Failure to Promoting Success, Transforming Community Supervision. If you have any questions for our presenters, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. Also, if you have any technical difficulties, please email info@mnjrc.org or text 612-361-3951. I would now like to turn it over to your presenters for today. Enjoy.
Thank you, Fernando. I'm Will Cooley with the Minnesota Justice Research Center. We have three presenters with us today: Katie Curry, Christina Bonstead, and Robin Wood. So I'm just going to give a brief overview here of our panel. So over the past 4 decades, the number of people on probation and supervised release in Minnesota has risen. At the same time, community supervision has remained underfunded, inconsistently applied, plagued by racial disparities, and ineffective at supporting people and strengthening communities. Supervision terms are too long, and prison intake in the state is driven by revocations, people being revoked to prison, with over 60% of new admissions resulting from supervision failures. These individuals comprise approximately 25% of the prison population on any given day and cost taxpayers more than $77 million per year. This system of warehousing people and churning them out of prison increases recidivism. In other words, crime goes up with this system, and it undermines public safety. So after decades of this system, we're making some changes. And that's what our first presenter is going to talk about. Katie Curry is a research assistant with the Minnesota Justice Research Center. Katie is also a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota. Katie's research talks a lot about public defenders. I went to Katie's job talk and I learned a lot, but today she's going to talk to us about community supervision here in Minnesota.
Yeah, thank you so much, Will, for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen really quick, just to make sure folks can see these slides. So y'all let me know if y'all aren't seeing this on your end. All right, cool. So yeah, I'm Katie. I've had the privilege to get to work with the Minnesota Justice Research Center for the past several months on the Reimagining Community Supervision project. And for folks who don't know exactly what community supervision is, it really refers to any time that someone serves time for a criminal conviction outside of prison or jail, right? So somewhere inside of the community. And in Minnesota, we kind of have 2 different forms of this. We have probation. This typically occurs when folks are serving time for usually like lesser offenses in the community. They tend to, it's used as an alternative to prison or jail. And then there's also what's often referred to in other states as parole, but it's in this state, we refer to it as supervised release. And this is for any time that folks are leaving prison and moving out of prison and re-entering their communities from prison. So that's just kind of a basic overview of like the types of kind of punishment and reforms we're going to be focusing on today. And yeah, just to kind of cover, skip this slide. Just to really go over what Will was sharing with us before, give a little more background on what community supervision looks like in Minnesota. Although we actually have one of the lowest incarceration rates in the United States, we have a huge number of people under community supervision, and especially probation. For example, of the over 100,000 people under correctional control in Minnesota in 2023, roughly 83% of these folks were under some form of community supervision. And this heightened rate of community supervision actually places us closer to peers in terms of correctional control with high incarceration states, right? So we're actually, if we include things like community supervision in our estimates, we actually look more similar to states like Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And we're currently ranked 12th in the nation in the total number of people we have under our criminal justice system. We also, as Will mentioned, see high rates of people being sent back to jail or prison under community supervision, and this is commonly referred to as revocation. And this can occur both anytime someone commits a new crime or if a person violates a condition of their supervision, such as failing a drug test or not meeting frequently enough with their supervising officer. And these are referred to as technical violations. And actually, a Council for State Governments report analyzed prison admissions back in 2019 in Minnesota and found that nearly 60% of these admissions were the result of supervision violations. And this includes both the technical violations I was just talking about, but also for people who had committed a new crime. And as Will also mentioned, right, this really, these supervision failures have been shown to not only increase recidivism, but also cost Minnesota taxpayers more than $77 million each year. We also know that Minnesota's community supervision system is characterized by stark inequities, in particular for Black and Indigenous people in the state. For example, in 2019, Black people made up only 6% of our state population, but represented more than 18% of the probation population and 27% of the supervised release population. And for Native Americans, they make up only 1% of the adult population in Minnesota, but the probation rate for Native Americans is 9 times higher than white adults. Minnesota is also unique in how our community supervision system is structured and administered. And there's a lot of complexity here, but what I really will just highlight is that we have 3 different delivery systems in place. And each system represents kind of a different arrangement between the Department of Corrections and county agencies to administer supervised release and probation services. And these different delivery systems, excuse me, can not only create complications for folks who are serving community sentences in different jurisdictions, but also has been connected to things like inconsistencies and kind of other issues in community supervision practices in the state. So this is just kind of to set up like where we're at right now with community supervision in Minnesota. But I really want to jump in today and outlining some of the recent reforms that happened in our most recent legislative session this year. And really after decades, right, of studies detailing the drawbacks of community supervision in Minnesota, in 2023, state elected officials acted with this kind of comprehensive set of supervision reforms that are really focused on reducing the number of people under correctional control, lowering instances of revocation back to prison or jail, and really just to create more opportunities and supports for folks with criminal records. And I should also mention, right, that these reforms were the result of tireless efforts in our state by local grassroots organizations and activists, academics, state leaders and policymakers, folks who have been impacted by the criminal legal system, and folks who work on the inside of the criminal legal system. We could really cover that entire trajectory in an entire conference. But I'm working on a report right now that kind of broadly outlines how these supervision reforms fall into 4 specific categories. So I'm just going to kind of briefly go through each of those categories and outline some of the changes that we're going to see in the coming years. So first and foremost, one of the main things we're going to see is some pretty critical funding changes. Over the next few years in particular, we're going to see a substantial increase in funding for community supervision agencies. And this is especially true for offices that are located inside tribal nations. For example, the allocation of over $190 million in the 2026 through 2027 fiscal year is roughly a 37% increase from the amount of funding that was appropriated to community supervision in 2022 to 2023. And within this amount, over $2.75 million has been allocated to tribal nations over the next few years to provide supervision and supportive services. And this is really representing an attempt to not only more equitably fund tribal nations in Minnesota, but also build stronger connections between state, county, and tribal government entities. And there also is going to be a change in the formula that's actually used to calculate how much funding a specific community supervision jurisdiction receives. And currently, the Commissioner of Corrections is tasked with completing a workload study to determine caseloads in different jurisdictions and to create a new funding formula that will more equitably fund and allocate funding across counties. We're also going to see some pretty significant changes to the way supervision actually looks and the supervision conditions that people have to serve during their time. First and foremost, we're going to see reduced long probation sentences across the state. So legislators actually capped probation sentences at 5 years for most offenses and applied this change retroactively. Another major shift was the creation of a timetable to eliminate all supervision fees by 2027. And counties cannot increase fee amounts during this time. So there can be no increase to fee amounts in between then and now. And this will reduce really some significant financial burdens for people under supervision in Minnesota. And in particular, criminal justice debts in our state have been shown to put the deepest financial burden on Indigenous folks. So there's an equity piece here as well. This legislation also includes the passage of the Minnesota Rehabilitation and Reinvestment Act, which includes many different elements that I could also cover in a whole nother session. But the idea really is that I'm going to focus on here, that one major piece of it is the creation of more opportunities for folks to gain early release, both while they're inside prison, but also while on supervised release by participating in rehabilitative programming and other kinds of goals. And then finally, while there's not too much specific language to revocation in the current bills, there is some effort to really focus on reducing revocations for people on probation and supervised release. And in particular, if there's a technical violation, such as failing a drug test or not attending enough meetings with a supervising officer, there's language in the current reforms to really discourage against using jail or prison in these instances. And the Department of Corrections, actually, their own strategic plan and mission for their organization this year includes a metric to reduce technical admissions to prison by 70% in the coming year. So there is some language in the specific department policies to at least push for this change. Another element of the 2023 reforms and really includes developing more uniformity and predictability in community supervision practices across the state and across the different agencies that implement community supervision. And really by developing more interconnected and data-informed infrastructure for agencies and other stakeholders. For example, the legislation establishes the creation of a community supervision advisory committee that will provide policy recommendations and kind of help to set more supervision standards across the state. And it really includes an array of different types of stakeholders. The committee is supposed to include people who work in community supervision, county commissioners, and people who have been under community supervision. The legislation also requires that all community supervisions now submit these comprehensive plans, which again can really help lay the foundation for different agencies to have more transparent kind of public communication about the different types of programs and services that are available in their jurisdictions and what they're doing. And then finally, the legislation also includes a provision to establish the creation of better data infrastructures on community supervision populations, really to just better track and document the impacts of current and future policy changes. And then finally, we also have seen some pretty significant changes to try to push for reducing barriers for folks in criminal records. Probably most monumentally is that the most monumental change was to reduce the now well-documented harms related to being able to vote. And now more than 55,000 Minnesotans were eligible to vote in this most recent election that were unable to before. And then we also saw some pretty significant increases in funding for different types of services and programs that really promote rehabilitation and reintegration for folks. And this includes $2.1 million allocated in 2024 and 2025 to create stable housing for the formerly incarcerated upon release, as well as over $1 million in reentry initiatives, including a culturally specific release program for Native Americans. So yeah, that's where I'll end. But there's a lot in these bills, and I had to cover a lot. So hope I didn't take too much time. But thank you guys so much for your time.
Not at all, Katie. Thank you so much. Did everybody get everything there? There should be a test at the end, I think, right? Yeah, and that's kind of just the tip of the iceberg, right, Katie? I mean, Katie could have talked about a lot more stuff that went on this year, but it's really important. So much effort in this space is put into policing and prisons. And yet, as Katie pointed out, community supervision is where it's at in Minnesota. It's where the biggest problems often lie. So next presenter is Robin Wood. And I'm so happy that Robin's with us today as a person who actually works in the system. Way too often, they get overlooked at conferences like this. Robin mentioned while we were talking before that she'd never heard of the Minnesota Justice Research Center before this. And so we look forward to working with her in the future. She's worked for Dodge and Olmsted Community Corrections since 1999, initially as a child protection social worker, and for the past 17 years as an intensive supervised release agent. She spends a lot of her time on race equity throughout the state, and she obtained her bachelor's in sociology from Briarcliff University. So I'll turn it over to you, Robin.
Thank you, Will. And I'm honored to be part of this group. So I will kind of build on what Katie talked about as far as the legislative changes and how kind of from the inside as an agent, I feel this will impact our clients. So I work down in Rochester, and I think in a community corrections agency that over the last 10, 15 years, I think we have been really progressive compared to some of our counterparts across the state in having some of these reforms before needing legislative change for someone to tell us to do these things. So I do feel very lucky to work in an agency where we've pushed for a lot of change. So some of the legislative changes that impact our clients of color, marginalized populations, and of course, those same folks that are overrepresented. I feel really the biggest one will be the 5-year cap. It's something that folks who have been sentenced over the last 10, 20, 30 years have gotten really long probation sentences. So a judge who feels, I'm not going to send this person to prison, but I still want to look tough on crime, will sentence a felony drug possession person to 20, 30 years, 40 years of probation. So I did run our numbers. So this is the Rochester community. The folks that it's affecting retroactively. So those folks who have already been sentenced, by the end of January, we will have 261 files. So some folks have more than one file, which will affect 232 of our clients that will be discharged from probation. And had it not been for this change, those folks would have been on supervision for the next 10, 15, 20 years. And the problem with that is if we keep somebody on supervision for that long, we're not doing them a service. And this ties into supervision fees. So those folks who are on a felony level supervision would be charged $500 a year for that. So if you look at somebody who's on supervision for 30 years being charged $500 a year, math is not my strong suit, but it's a lot of money. And some files are only kept open for that fee not being paid, and they go after their taxes. It affects their credit scores, and then it's just a ripple effect of their lives. So we have 232 clients that we will be able to close out their files by January. They will no longer be on supervision. And I think that's just going to be an automatic impact, and that will be across the state, because some changes, as I'll talk about, are going to be jurisdictions are going to fight those changes. But this is one where it's going to be agencies won't have that discretion. They will have to close those files, which will be great. And I think oversight from that will be from the courts, which will be a really good thing. Also, my clients, the voter rights being restored gets them more involved in their communities. It makes them feel they do have a voice, and we encourage our clients and folks that we work with to become involved. And that is just a great impact for our clients. And again, like I said, the supervision fees being sunsetted will be great. Those are just, I have multiple clients who are being released from prison, and they're trying to make ends meet, and they're trying to get their job, and they're trying to pay rent. And then they get a letter in the mail saying, oh, and by the way, you owe $500 for supervision. And to get those phone calls from those clients, it's heartbreaking, because we can ask for an exception, but a lot of times it's denied. And so to have that just be gone, and that again will be something across the state that will be automatic. Now I want to also talk about the 50%. So right now, I'll back up. Right now, if somebody's sentenced to prison and they have a sentence, let's say for 15 years, they right now serve 75% of their time behind bars, and then serve the other 25% on supervised release is what we call it. The legislative change is hoping to, for most cases, most offenses, to reduce that to 50% of that time. If those people participate in services while in prison. And those services, from my understanding, and Katie can correct me if I'm wrong, are a lot of cognitive skills classes, treatment classes. And when I say cognitive skills classes, those are classes that we teach as far as community corrections to work on criminal thinking, it's outside of like chemical dependency treatment. So it's to stop and think, to have a different approach to your peers, to your family, to high risk areas in your life that may have led you to commit crimes. And we are trained to facilitate those. So here's going to be the problem I foresee for the Department of Corrections for people who are in prison. Right now, our prisons are in a crisis with staffing for corrections officers, and folks are being mandatory overtime. So I am worried, and I know there'll be funding increases, but we still have to have the folks to teach these classes, to provide treatment. So not only staff can be trained to teach some of these cognitive skills classes, but for treatment and more intensive things, you're going to have folks that are certified to do that. So we're going to need people with higher level certification degrees to teach some of these classes. I see a huge gap in that actually being implemented. I hope, and I don't know if the legislative changes allow for this, of who will oversee this, and if it's not implemented, what the repercussions can be. But right now, we do have folks that we send to prison that were originally on a probation file, and they're in there for 5 to 10 years or longer, that come out that have never had treatment, that weren't offered any classes. And so there's going to have to be some huge changes. We, from the other side, from community corrections in Olmsted County and a few counties across the state, have implemented what we call dosage for probation clients. So again, not folks who have been to prison, but probation clients, we call it dosage. And this is a way for clients to engage in treatment, cognitive skills classes, not just chemical dependency treatment, to reduce their time on supervision. So if somebody completes 300 hours of dosage type classes, they can be discharged from supervision. Again, imagine being somebody with a family, a job, transportation issues, language barriers, needing to complete 300 hours of classes, still a lot. So there's a lot of barriers to some of these efforts that we're going to have an answer for. The other piece, and I think Katie touched on this, is the culture shift. And I think sometimes we need to remember we're talking the whole state of Minnesota. So we have different cultures across our wonderful state, but we have agents. I've done this job a long time. I think I feel confidently I have come along with these changes compared to who I was as a agent 10 years ago. But we have people across the state that have not made this shift, and we have people in power and leadership who have not made that shift. So we have to have a huge culture shift with our outlook and how we develop relationships with our clients. And that is just kind of what I want to end with, is that relationship we have with our clients, I feel, is our most important tool. We have to have that trust with them, and we want them to trust us. Otherwise, us delivering services will not be effective. So those are some of the areas I wanted to touch on, and kind of some of the gaps I think that could come up over the next few years. So thank you.
Thanks, Robin. Really appreciate your insight and your frankness on some of these things, right? It's one thing to pass policy. It's another thing to actually implement policy. So there's some really good questions coming in the Q&A, but we'll have time to get to those after all three presenters. So I'm now going to turn it over to Christina Bonstead. Christina is a certified forensic peer support specialist with an emergency medicine clinical background. As a person who has experienced incarceration, Bonstead is committed to lending her voice and story to others. She's also a part of the Reducing Revocations Challenge in Ramsey County. So she's provided some experience in that effort because, as Katie talked about, way too many people on supervision end up back in prison or in jail in this state. So Christina, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Will. And thank you everyone for being here and doing this work. You know, I didn't know how important it was until it happened to me, right? And so, you know, I believed in the system. I naively believed in the system, and I thought it was a system of rehabilitation. And, you know, oftentimes I get my lessons this way, right? And I'm okay with that because I know that I can hopefully help the next person. And I'm supposed to be talking about how these new changes are going to affect me being on supervision. And quite frankly, I've asked my agents, you know, what does this look like? And they don't know. They're waiting to be told what to do. And so I looked at the DOC's website, and it looks like they're, you know, getting some people together to come up with the changes and the decisions, right? And so I wanted to talk about kind of my fear behind that not being transparent and them not being held accountable. And I find that a lot of the times these things happen behind closed doors, and we start here with this expectation that it's going to look like this, those of us who voted, right? And then at the end of it, it looks like this, which is pretty far off that mark. I want to have faith in some of the individuals that I've met in those positions. So I really do have faith. I wanted to talk about my love for Minnesota and how much I love it here, because I can really feel like people genuinely care about other people here. And that's one of the things that I really love about this state. And I was really surprised to learn that we were not a state of rehabilitation, and in fact, one of punishment. One of the government officials that were a part of the Restore the Vote, I believe I heard her say something, and it was, you know, we've been using the stick and it's not been working, so now it's time to use the carrot, something along those lines, right? But it's so true. Like we're not teaching kids or teaching people how to do things, you know, based upon fear and punishment. It's, you know, we're giving positive reinforcement. We're showing them, we're giving them opportunities to make mistakes. And I think changing our life and changing our mentality and changing the way that we move about in society, that takes time. It takes a lot of time and effort, and dedication and motivation, quite frankly. And when you've got somebody, you know, kind of in charge of you and your future, basically saying, hey, you're just going to mess up anyway. Like that's kind of a prophecy, a self-fulfilling prophecy there. If you're being treated as if you're just going to mess up anyway, you know, or you're treated as if you can't be trusted, then what's the point? You know, there's a lot of what's the point that comes up with this for me. Why bother? And I try to stay away from the hopelessness that can come from having been incarcerated after 5.5 years of supervision on a technical violation. I really tried, but it still comes, you know, and it still rears its ugly head. And I hide away for a few days and I get it back together. I'm really happy to hear what what was her name? Peyton, the young lady last night that shared. I really love that she touched upon people with lived experience and how taxing emotionally and mentally this can be for us. There were days that I had to meet with the Ramsey County Community Corrections for this Reducing Revocation Challenge. And I had only been out of prison 4 months when I signed up to do this. And because I knew I needed to heal. It was very selfish, really. But I had to say, hey, I don't have the capability for this today. I don't have it. And they were really understanding and very patient and kind. And they met me where I was. And that's, again, something that's kind of lacking sometimes. I feel like, and it's a big culture thing. Everybody's talking about culture. And I'm going to qualify this by saying I've had numerous supervising agents. I've had people that I'm just a number two. I'm just, they're checking off their boxes. And I was released on ISR. I'm a CIP graduate. It's like prison on, CIP is Challenge Incarceration Program. It's like prison on steroids, folks. And you're released to a team of agents. I called them my secret agent people, because they're always spying on you, you know. The first gentleman I met, he said, I said, hey, I really need this one thing, you know, in order to complete something they were asking me to do. And he said, yeah, absolutely. And I said, really? Was that easy? And he was like, yeah. He's like, I'm here to help you succeed. Like, if you fail, I haven't done my job. So, like, what do you need to succeed? What do you need to do well? And do you know that's the first time anybody in this capacity has ever asked me that question? Ever. I'm in school, and I'd been going to school, and I said, I will start this semester when I leave, and I'm gonna go right back. And do you know who asked me how I did on my exams? How are you doing in school? How's it going? You know, what are you doing for your break? Not my dad. And probably a lot of the people in my position, their dads aren't asking about them either. But do you know who did? Katie, my supervising agent. She genuinely, and she is excited when I do well. She is happy for me. And that's huge. You know, they took the time to get to know me. They took the time to build trust. I trust them. They trust me. They didn't approach me as if I was less than, or I was inconvenient, or I was just some criminal, you know. We all know about that stigma. They treated me like an equal, and they met me where I was, and that is so important, and it's helped a lot. I think I might be about finished, but I wanted to talk about one thing here. Is the word amenable. Did I say that correctly, guys? So I looked up the word, right? It says easily persuaded, open, receptive, responsive, capable of. And so we talk about people being amenable to rehabilitation, and we put them on probation because people think that they are, right? We are. And yet what I don't understand is that, like, if I miss a meeting, or if I go to reuse and I slip away for a little bit, at what point am I no longer amenable? Like, what makes me, because I didn't call, that one thing makes me not capable of changing my life for the better. And all I'm worth is to be put into a cell, because that's really the message we're being sent. That's how I felt, that my worth was simply, that's all it was. So I don't know if I've done my job here today, but I just wanted to share some of my own experiences. And I think one of the biggest things is, like, this money that's being thrown at this problem. Nothing's going to help until the culture changes, honestly. And it comes from the top down. And you know, we talk about a few bad apples can ruin the bunch. And I think it's really important to start this now, you know, before all the infrastructure gets put into place, you know, to start shifting that culture, because it made a world of difference for me. I feel safe with these agents. I've never felt that before. I don't trust them. I mean, I'm trying really hard, but, you know, more than I ever have any other ones. So there's that.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you so
me.
much. Yep. No, thank you. And okay, so one of the themes I'm picking up here is variance, I think. And Katie started us off with wild racial disparities in this state, people being treated differently. Robin hit on this a little bit too. She comes from a progressive county where she's got a lot of confidence that these things will be implemented. Not so sure, perhaps, about other counties in Minnesota. Christina's point as well. Some agents didn't seem to really care much about her future. Other agents are actually a big part of her success. And I think that's a hard thing, right? Because we write policy for everybody. We write policy for this big, diverse state. But will it be implemented in a fair way that people actually can trust it? And we don't have these disparities. For those of you who've seen the map, some counties send people to prison at really high rates in Minnesota, and some don't. Some have really low rates, like almost European level rates, right? So that's one of the things, the themes we'll talk about in our Q&A here. But we do have some questions coming in. I'm going to throw this one to Robin first. Any thoughts or indication that judges, and this is, the county to county thing, may send more people to prison because of the 5-year cap? They don't think it's enough, and so I'm going to send this person to prison instead of probation.
That has been my fear, and I know in other states, I think there has been a cap, and I don't know if if that's been a theme, and maybe Katie would know this, that other states have seen that. I know locally in Rochester, some judges have done those long probation sentences to look tough on crime. So if that's not an option, my fear is that they may just say, I still want to look tough on crime. I can't sentence you to 30 years probation. I'm going to send you to prison. So that is a concern. I don't know how that will play out. So in the next year or two, what those stats will be.
Yeah, and I assume that's something that the Sentencing Guidelines Commission, and we're lucky in this state that we have one of those, is going to be monitoring carefully, right? Because so many good intentioned reforms in this country that end up making things worse. Brianna Payton brought this up last night. We could replace cash bail with something much worse. So be careful what we wish for, right? So this next question, Robin, I'm going to send this one to you too. People have been paying these really big fees. Is there a chance they can get some of this money back after 5 years, or it's gone?
It's gone. There's not going to be a retroactive payment, unfortunately.
Yeah. All right. Next question. As we move forward with these policy changes and reforms, how can practitioners and administrators of probation programs better work with the community and other stakeholders to ensure we're being effective and moving in the right direction? So again, I think this is the checking on implementation. Our goals more aligned than most people think, and we can make big changes working together. And I want to point this out, that this is part of this panel, right? We've got a reformer, an expert, an impacted person, and a person that works in the system. So maybe Katie, you want to start us off with this question?
Yeah, I'd love to, actually, because I was actually just in a session for the less is more reforms in New York City, which for folks who may be unfamiliar, there were these big set of kind of probation reforms that started in New York City, but have since, and parole too, sorry, but have since expanded throughout the entire state. And I think this was like a really critical piece to the success of these reforms, which really were pushing on the idea, right, of less is more, right? So having way fewer people on probation and parole, you can more effectively use the resources that are available and gear it towards folks that, would have to like more be assessed as higher risk, or would be assessed as like being on needing to be on probation or parole for a longer period of time. But one of the key things that I think was a big success for that campaign, and like something that they were really presenting on and honing in on, were these like town halls that they were able to conduct over the past I think they've done it over the past 2 years since the reforms have been implemented, and really bringing in community members to the table across like all of these different, like they went to all different types of counties, like not just New York City. They went to, I don't know like New York towns very well, but they went to a bunch of different counties and were able to collect stories from folks who were, serving time, or who had been on release for a long period of time and now were off, and family members, etc. They were able to bring all of these community members together at a town hall to offer feedback, and like developed a report like based on that. And so I think like having essentially just more mechanisms in place for community engagement and community involvement, both within both within like probation offices and community supervision offices, but also things like, this is kind of what we've been pointing to, and a theme in this talk too, is like court communities and other folks who are, these like stakeholders who are actually helping implement these policies, like judges, prosecutors, public defenders. I think there's a lot still left to be done in these reforms. I agree with Christina. I think there's a lot of money being thrown at things, but not enough thinking through how are we going to actually implement this. And I have the same concerns about judges and prosecutors circumventing some of this. I think that happens a lot when reforms get implemented. And in particular, I've seen that a lot in research that I've done about public defense. So I think that's like one key critical aspect, is just like implementing more of these things like town halls, actual mechanisms where communities can be not only included, but actually help hold folks accountable. I think that's like a key piece, is like power sharing too. And that was really a major success of the Less is More campaign.
I think Katie teed you up there a little bit. One or two things that you think this could help build trust, because you talked a lot about, I don't think there's a whole lot of trust in the system. You think there's ways, one or two things we could build that trust between impacted communities and probation?
I mean, when I was working with with Ramsey County, a few things that came to mind was just having like absconding, I think they call it, right, is a failure to show up or whatever. Maintain contact, I think, right, is one of the biggest drivers of revocations. And the studies show it's really oftentimes a resource issue, right? But I had suggested even like holding monthly, monthly gatherings where probation officers are there and they say, hey, come turn yourself in. We will not arrest you. Let's get this taken care of for you. We'll get you a court date, have somebody over there, but also have partner with community services and help people, right? Like I associate them with with the people that are trying to put us in prison. Like, and a lot of people, I think, associate them with that, particularly in the places I grew up in. And until we see them doing something different, it's easy to assume they're still doing the same things. So I think I was joking and I said, it sounds like you might need a PR agent.
Yeah. No, that's yeah. Robin, thoughts?
So over the last year for intensive supervised release, we are working on reform on our practices and policies. And part of that, we did do focus groups using an outside person, so not us facilitating it. We used one of our community partners, and they did that across the state with focus groups of clients who are currently on intensive supervised release to get feedback of where to start. And then that reform has been in the process for the last year and should be implemented in January. And again, I will point out that will be great. We're still going to have a lot of, here's an example of what I'm talking about. So about 10 years ago, there was a big change. I don't think it was a big change, but it seemed to the mass as a big change. We used to, when someone's coming out of prison, we get a packet that says this is where they want to live, or they don't have an option of where to live. But once in a while, they would have an option. They want to live with, let's say, their girlfriend. The practice was you would then call the landlord to get permission for that person to live there. Well, you can imagine if an agent calls a landlord and says, hey, this scary person coming out of the Department of Corrections wants to live there, what the answer would be. No, great. Okay, they're homeless, or they can't live with their girlfriend and their families or their wife or their mother. They're going to have to live at a halfway house or something like that. So about 10 years ago, the change was, per policy, you can no longer call landlord unless they're a level 3 sex offender. So the highest risk sex offender is public notification. And it was presented at a conference with all the intensive supervised release agents. It was mutiny. It was, how can you do this? This is the worst thing. So that was about 10 years ago. So fast forward now, there's going to be some big changes and shifts in how we do supervision, revocations, violations. There was a little peak of it last year at our conference, and then this year they're going to roll out bigger changes. We're going to have folks, which great, if you don't like it, find another job, but we're going to have folks who are going to fight those changes, not just agents, supervisors, district supervisors. So when I talk about the culture shift, there's going to have to be a huge culture shift for these changes to be more than lipstick on a pig kind of thing, like to be actual changes that impact our clients. So, and like Christina said, I think that's got to come from the top down and the bottom up. We need buy-in from agents too.
Great. Yeah, and if you have more questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A. But Robin, I'm going to follow up with you, and it's something we talked about in the waiting room before getting here. The difficulty of engaging people who actually work inside the system. And you said this is, your first MNJRC event. In the past, we've invited police officers, and they often don't want to come. But then I got to be honest, I come to some of these things, and there's some pretty harsh language, right? That the carceral system is modern day slavery. It's Jim Crow 2.0. And you've done all this racial equity work. What's been your experience interacting with people that don't work in the system but want to change it? And how can we build those bridges or have at least difficult conversations with each other?
I think the folks exist within the system that want to change it and don't feel good about some of the things they do. I was one of those people that when I started this position, I was 30 years old and did what I was told and thought it was the best thing to do. But after a few years, I started feeling really crappy about the decisions I've made. And I've talked to clients that I sent back for some like really minuscule technical violations, and uprooted their lives. But you have to own that and know we're in the system, but we don't have to be the system. And I think there's so much potential with folks that do this work that want to rock the boat and want to do things differently. There's some folks that are going to fight that and don't want to hear that message. But like I know in Olmsted County, we've those folks have moved on to other things after a while. When the message is consistently delivered, there's always going to be maybe a few strong holdouts that their voice seems bigger than it is. But I think the majority of folks within the system want things to be different.
Yeah, and so that the question goes to you, Katie, and in Robin's terms there. Last night a anti-domestic violence person said she was really impressed last night because it was one of the first things she'd been to where the speaker, Breonna Payton, actually presented a roadmap to making things better instead of just saying the system is terrible, let's burn it to the ground, right? Do you think we're learning here with community supervision that we just can't tear things down, that we have to build better things up?
Yeah, I think so. And I think these reforms are a really good first step in helping to build that up and building up that infrastructure. And especially things like, things that maybe would be like overlooked in the reforms, like a data infrastructure. Those sorts of things can really help with creating more targeted reforms, with creating more meaningful changes, because we can actually track them. So yes, I do think that we are able to, I think a lot of the times it is easier for reformers to just, critique a recent reform that's come out and then just change it automatically after a few years, But I think at least from the research that I've done about different campaigns across the United States, and especially like less is more and the success in New York there, that was a big key piece, was like leadership buy-in, right? And I'm talking about leadership in probation offices. Like there were people who were in the leadership of the community supervision offices who wanted these reforms to happen. There were people who were working in the county and like state local governments that wanted these reforms to happen. Like you have to have folks who are passionate about social change in all of these different fields, right? All of these different kind of venues to be able to actually push a reform forward. And a lot of the times I think that's where sometimes, like, especially if you have things like outside groups who are coming in to help like bring in legislation, sometimes they can kind of like, okay, the bill passed and we're done, like it's time to move on. And I think like what's going to be critical for this legislation to be successful and really move forward is for a lot of organizations like Minnesota Justice Research Center and other groups in the state to really help work with the offices, with the folks who work inside the system, actually figure out how to implement these things, and actually make sure that they're, you know, that it's transparent and people are held accountable. I think that's like going to be a key piece. We can't just, you know, change the policy and expect for it to, you know, be a panacea for everything. It really, that's where the rubber meets the road, is in the implementation. And I think a lot of the times, especially with criminal justice reform, which obviously is a really complicated, there's a lot of I think a lot of emotional and like moral questions, right, that are built into these kinds of reforms. So I think there's always going to be a lot of debate and struggle that is inherent to that. But I think that if we actually meaningfully engage in that across these different kind of professions, across different kinds of stakeholders, that we can actually bring about reforms that would bring about meaningful change. But it requires a lot of work, and culture change is extremely difficult, right? I mean, I think that what Robin's speaking to, right, is we're seeing a shift in like what it means to be a probation officer for some folks. But that has been what, like, you know, you've been in the field for what, like 15 years now, Robin? That's been a long time coming, right? And in particular, we're still dealing with a lot of these tough on crime mindsets that have like, you know, been a perpetual problem in American criminal justice pretty much since like the 1980s. So I think like that's just something to think through, is we have to do a lot of I think also like a key piece for me as an academic is a lot of political education too, about what does this actually look like over time and how can we actually do this better. So I think that's like there's a lot of moving pieces, but that's kind of my main takeaway.
And Christina, I think when we talk about that meaningful engagement that Katie talked about, so much of that is engaging with people that actually have experience in incarceration and being supervised. But can you talk about some of your own challenges there, that you're not getting paid to do this, right? I mean, you reached out to me. The only way I met Christina is she reached out to me. It's really hard to track people down on probation. It's really hard to find people who are on supervised release and say, hey, do you want to talk about your experiences? And of course, some of them don't want to. So could you talk about some of your challenges as we meaningfully engage people who've actually experienced this?
You know, I go into these meetings sometimes with my own stigma attached, you know, like I worry about how people are going to see me, or if they're going to respond to me well. You know, sometimes you know, it gets a bit overly emotional for me, you know, prison is traumatizing. That's just what it is, right? And for somebody who's already been traumatized, which most of us have, it just adds to that. So, you know, I went through a lot of like hypervigilance, you know, coming out, and that was really difficult. And just, you know, just the money, you know, it costs more money. I had to take loans out when I went to prison. I'm still paying them back. You know, I had to get a really menial job when I first got out, because I wasn't allowed to do the work that I did, where I could make, you know, decent money. Again, that's why I'm still paying back the loan, because I couldn't afford to do it when I first got out. You know, I remember I had to wear an ankle monitor for an alcohol thing, and my dad had a stroke. And he was on a ventilator, and I had to fly down, and they wouldn't remove the ankle thing, and I had to go through the airport. Like, yeah, it was super embarrassing. Like, it wasn't, you know, I was like, whatever, it is what it is, you know, like, but yeah, it's not fun at all. You know, I was going to nursing school before before my sentence was executed. And, you know, there's a big concern for me about being able to get licensed now. You know, am I going to be able to get that job that gives me, you know, that fulfills me in ways that I desire? So, you know, there's a lot of challenges, and even just meeting other people who have been through the same experience and have ended up where I want to be. You know, one of my biggest regrets is not having a college degree. And I promised myself I was going to have at the very least a bachelor's. You know, but what do I do with that? How do I make money? You know, and so now I'm at a point where I'm like, I'm kind of floundering. And talking about this stuff really is I knew I needed to heal. I knew that this was poison inside of me, and it would probably drive me to drink, honestly. And so my buddies at that anonymous group said resentments are the #1 offenders. And so I can't afford to be resentful about this. And so I have to help, you know, help make it better. So that's,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate
Yeah.
all of you being here, but it does speak to, oh, you've got all these challenges you're trying to overcome to you know, get your life back in order. And by the way, we expect you to solve the problem of community supervision in your spare time and show up for
I
meetings
got
and
it.
show up for, yeah. So, I mean, there is something to be said for, we have to be kind of careful on how we engage people that actually have this experience. All right. Thanks, everyone in the room. I've got the message. We need to wrap up. I appreciate everyone coming out. We had a good number of participants here in the session. I really appreciate the honesty of all three of our presenters. Nothing was sugar-coated here. This is, there's so much. I mean, my heart warmed when I heard Robin say, for instance, 232 clients are going to be discharged who were on probation for more than 5 years. That's great news, right? Robin's office doing outreach so people will vote. That's great news. But then we all said, well, we got a lot of work to do ahead of us, a lot of work. So it's a good to have these honest conversations about what's ahead. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate you joining.
Thanks, everybody.